welcome to the new session and this new session. And we have two very interesting speech today. Session 3 lead is about voyage and immigration. And the first one is by Miki Takasuna from the Tokyo University, International University, and he will talk about Chiwa, travel to Italy in 1934, which is also a very interesting period in which many philosophers, psychologists, scholars in general were traveling all around the world. I remember, for example, Bertrand Russell, that more or less in the same period he was teaching in Beijing University and in Tokyo University, and many others. John Dewey, for example, was teaching in the same places. So it is a very nice and interesting speech about how people were living, how scholars were living at the time, and what were their interests. Please.
Thank you. So good morning.
Yeah.
You can use.
Please.
Okay.
You could use the folder if you like.
Okay. Okay. Does it work?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I have been collecting documents about the Japanese psychologists, especially before the World War II, who have been studying abroad in the United States and Europe. And today I will talk about a Japanese psychologist, Hiroshi Chiwa, who had a chance to travel to Europe from 1933 to 1935. Especially I focus on his just 11 days trip to Italy in October 1934, roughly 90 years ago. Okay. So this is Chiwa. In 1891, Chiwa was born in Okayama, a western part of Japan. Okayama locates next to Hiroshima Prefecture, so near Hiroshima. Chiwa went to the 6th high school in Okayama, which was founded in 1900, and there met Professor Ishiro Miyake, an English teacher, but obtained PhD in psychology from Yale University, and a good friend of Matataro Matsumoto, who later became a mentor of Chiwa at Tokyo Imperial University. Chiwa kept studying under Professor Matsumoto until he became an assistant, then later an associate professor of the same university. Chiwa's main research area was industrial and occupational psychology, which was also much affected by the work of Professor Matsumoto. However, his interest gradually shifted to Gestalt psychology in the 1930s, and when he had a chance to study abroad with national expense, it seemed reasonable to go to Berlin, Germany. So he went to Berlin first. In the fall of 1933, he began keeping a sort of diary, not so big, but small diary, during his travel. It seemed to me the first several weeks he could not afford to keep writing much as later. I have worked to decipher his handwriting to gain his impression of Italian psychology around the year 1934. But it is very hard for me to, decipher his handwriting in Japanese. After the first semester in Berlin, he began traveling through Europe. As I have described in the abstract of this presentation, until the mid-20th century, Japanese scholars studied abroad in one of two ways, namely Ryugaku and Yugaku. Ryugaku scholars tend to study longer at a particular foreign university, where many also receive academic degrees. In contrast, Yugaku scholars visited many countries and universities to read the most varied information. Most of the scholars who received the special national scholarship to study abroad follow the Yugaku style. This standard applied to Chiwa, who has already been an associate professor of the Tokyo Imperial University and study abroad at government expense. Accordingly, he mainly stayed and studied in Berlin, Germany, but occasionally traveled to various countries, including Belgium, France, Switzerland, UK, and Italy here. So, according to the history of psychology in Italy, this is a first travel summary. So it began with Berlin, Germany. He studied at Berlin University under Wolfgang Köhler and Kurt Lewin. And then he traveled through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, Germany, then Belgium, France, Switzerland, Italy, and back to Munich. Yes. So, according to the history of psychology in Italy, as written in Cimino and Foschi, 2012, between 1920 and 1940, there was no significant increase in the number of university chairs, laboratories, or journals. Moreover, by 1938, in all of Italy, there remained only 2 psychology chairs at academic institutions. These were in Rome and in Milan. It is not known if Chiwa anticipated this kind of decline, but nevertheless, he visited Milan and Rome. The reason why he chose these universities to visit partly reflected his mentor's request. I will refer to that in later. In Milan, he visited 2 universities, the University of Milan and the Catholic University of Milan. He went first to the University of Milan to see Professor Casimiro Donizelli, a physiologist and psychologist. The University of Milan, the university buildings of Milan were impressively magnificent, and the psychology building held 22 rooms, that's much large as the physiology one. Donizelli showed Chiwa a variety of experimental apparatuses, especially the rooms with ergographs, such as dynamographs, chronoergographs, etc. And Chiwa's attention was focused on 2 specific things: the studies of psychological and physiological influences of aviation, and the psychotechniques or psychological testing. He found some experimental instruments for pilots here, but noted, I quote, "It seems not much experimental studies are conducted here." Next day, Chiwa went to the Catholic University of Milan, but because he did not write a letter to Professor Agostino Gemelli. In advance, he was not able to meet him. Gemelli was a priest and he went to Rome then when Chiwa made a visit. Instead, a female scholar here, Giuseppina Pastore, showed him insight. Chiwa was impressed by the studies done by Gemelli and Pastore, which ranged from animal studies to linguistic ones, especially the aviation studies. Pastore said to Chiwa that Gemelli loved airplane so much that he got on the plane, what kind of plane I didn't know, but he got on the plane every day, almost every day. But but he seemed to be a priest, but he loves airplane. I don't know why. Gemelli later sent Chiwa a few reprints, including the one titled L'orientazione lontana nel volo in aeroplano, the distant orientation during the flight in airplane, maybe. Chiwa belonged to Tokyo Imperial University, which established the Department of Aeronautic Psychology in 1920, after consulting with Professor Matsumoto. The department conveniently arranged the aeronautical laboratories close to the psychological laboratory in Tokyo. Aviation or aeronautical effect was not his main thing for Chiwa, but he had to report about it to his colleagues after returning to Japan. So he went to find this kind of information in various places. After the state of Milan, a few days of the recording memo was skipped. Chiwa would go to Padua, but he mistook the train and had to transit. He should have taken some photos with him, but no written record was found. And then Rome. He seemed to stay in Rome for 3 days. On October 22nd, he went to the University of Rome to see Professors Mario Ponzo and Ferruccio Vanissoni. Chiwa had written a letter to Ponzo from Berlin that he would visit him, and the response from Ponzo, written in German, was inserted in the memo. Still today, Ponzo must be the most famous Italian psychologist for Japanese psychologists due to the Ponzo illusion. But Ponzo showed him the experimental rooms and said that his laboratory belonged to the medical school now, and there he was doing mainly the studies of psychodynamics. Ponzo also told Chiwa that a new large building was going to be built in 2 years and asked returning to Rome to see. Both Ponzo and Vanissoni handed him their business cards. So this is Vanissoni's and this is Ponzo's. On Ponzo's card, Chiwa wrote in the upper space, Ponzo said he knew bowling in Harvard and kept in correspondence with him. Ponzo asked me to write a letter after returning to Japan. And also in the lower space, Ponzo said some time ago that Japanese came to visit here. It must be Mr. Kirihara. Shigemi Kirihara was one of the Japanese pioneers in industrial and occupational psychology. So he must be. One interesting recording was a conversation he had with Dr. M. Tantin E. Cohen. But this Cohen handed Chiwa a card here, as shown here, though the Cohen's handwriting was unclear. First, Chiwa read as Colun, C-O-L-U-N, but as I have shown the card to Harry Whittaker, former professor of Northern Michigan University, he suggested me that the last name should be Cohen. But the first name was not yet clear. So Cohen was a young American psychologist visiting from Harvard as a Sheldon Fellow in psychology. Usually, Sheldon Fellow is a one-year academic travel abroad scholarship offered by Harvard Divinity School. That's all. But I don't know why Cohen would apply. When Banisoni introduced Dr. Cohen to Chiwa for the first time, Chiwa was talking with Banisoni about the language difficulty, English or in German, for Japanese. Then Cohen wanted to talk with Chiwa, so he began to talk with him reluctantly in English, and then noticed that Cohen came to Rome because Edwin Bowling told him to. But Cohen found it boring or disappointed because it was focused on psychotechniques and populated by medical students, not psychology students. The theme of Cohen's thesis was emotion or affection of pleasantness in experimental settings. Cohen asked Chiwa of the situation of psychology in Japan, as Chiwa told him that studies on psychotechnics were not much conducted in the university laboratories. Cohen said he would like to go to Japan. When Chiwa asked about the status quo of the American psychology, Cohen referred several prospective psychologists such as Edward Tolman in California. He also mentioned to Max Wertheimer, Kurt Levine, which he pronounced as Ruin, Erich von Bosten in New York, but these were all Jewish immigrants from Germany. In Berlin, Chiwa was attending to lectures given by Wolfgang Köhler on Gestalt psychology. So Chiwa talked to Cohen that Köhler would emigrate to the United States, but Cohen already knew it. Cohen expected that with Köhler and Bowling at Harvard, the future of psychology there would be brilliant, but also deplored that it would leave fewer teaching positions for younger professors. In an encouraging response, Chiwa suggested that having prominent names at Harvard would soon profit the younger generation. So, in Chiwa's review of his visit to Milan and Rome, he wrote that, like in Germany after the rise of the Nazi regime, psychology in Italy trended toward practical things. These included psychological tests, psychotechniques, and physical exercise, which arose as a result of the death of aged eminent scholars under fascism. Overall, Chiwa was impressed by Gemelli's work, but also noted that the number of laboratories and researchers, as well as the quality of the studies, seemed much better in Japan. There's also some both true. From 1920s to 1940, it is really contrasting that there was no significant increase in the number of university chairs and laboratories in Italy, while there was a proliferation of psychology laboratories in Japan. And finally, I'm especially impressed by his bitter comments about Ponzo, as he assumed an air of importance. Ponzo once told Chiwa that the time of Sante de Sanctis, Federico Chiesa, or Vittorio Benussi in Italian psychology has passed away, and now it is the time of Ponzo himself, Banisoni, and Gemelli. Ponzo paid no attention to Donizelli. In the last sentence, Chiwa wrote that Ponzo was always boastful, but not much of a scholar, so Ponzo's boastful words. That is my most impressive part. So thank you for listening to this small travel of Japanese who found 1930s Italian psychology. Thank you.
Please, just a question before asking the audience for question. Are the early studies in psychology in Japan linked with the problem of race and biological problems?
Race problems.
Because you underlined here, there was quite a strong link between Chiwa and the German psychology environment, right? And of course, the German Nazism were fixed with the biological and race problem. So I remember that in Japan there was also a link between them. So I just am curious to know if there were a similar problem with studies with German links.
Yes, during the 1940s, the first half of the 1940s, there was a sort of racial studies in Japan, especially the comparison with Japanese people with like Taiwanese or Chinese people or something like that. And there was a sort of a German influence of this kind of racial problems. But the time is relatively short to have that kind of studies. Is it okay?
Please.
Yes, I really enjoyed this long series about the interaction of Japanese visitors with the various labs and sometimes backwards and forwards. So take this opportunity to thank you for continuing this work in the spirit of our historical research in general. My question's about Chiwa's own education before he comes to Italy. It seems that when I see the face of Friedrich Kieshoff, and I think about what must have been the laboratories of Gemelli too, there was a lot of emphasis on physiological apparatus and physiological approaches in their brand of psychology. Did Chiwa also have this physiological training, or would it have been more philosophical or more restricted to, let's say, Wundtian kinds of psychological experiments? I know it's later than that, 10 or 20 years later.
But it's more like, I say, experimental psychology, lacking not philosophical, not too much physiological.
Not very much physiological.
No, but
for Chiwa.
For Chiwa and
Did
Tokyo,
he notice it in Italy though?
Tokyo Imperial University had a laboratory which was affected by the influenced by the American sort of army studies. So it's much more American psychology trained, not the European ones.
So did he make any comments about the physiological work? Or?
Some physiological work, but not so like an ergographs or some kind of experimental apparatuses we Japanese use, in a sense. But not so much physiological. I mean, how should I say? What physiological? What do you mean by like a Wundtian physiological psychology?
Well, yes, it's Wundtian physiological psychology, which is experimental psychology.
Yes.
There's also Kieshoff, who actually studied if I'm not mistaken, smell and other real sort of, you had to develop physiological apparatus for measuring things. And please
Yes,
all
yes,
these things.
it's kind of airgraphs.
Airgraphs.
Yes.
Any other question, please?
First of all, thank you for your presentation. And I would like to ask you if Chiwa, when he went to Padua, if he met Vittorio Benussi, or if he visited the Padua Laboratory of Psychology. And
He would go too, but he could not.
okay.
So that's why he didn't write anything about in Padua.
Okay. And about this, for example, there is another curiosity that I have, and it seems that he was interested more in psychotechnics, since he met the Roman psychologists of the Institute of Psychology at Sapienza. They were Gemelli, Bansoni, Bonzo. They were really interested in, actually they founded the psychotechnics in Italy during fascism. So I wanted to ask you if Chiwa was also interested in, for example, Gestalt theory,
Yes.
or psychoanalysis, if he also had the thought about this other field of psychology.
So before he came to Europe, he did some psychotechnics work by himself. But after returning to Japan in 1934, he began to write about the Gestalt psychology. So he was affected by Kuhler's lectures, especially the lectures. And he met the final day of Kurt Lewin, and who's going to the States, United States. He met him at the platform of one station. He had a photo, but I personally looked at that, but no, I couldn't show it.
More questions? No. So thank you.